is a standard, goes out the window. How do you spend money if you're 32 years old and you realize one day, this is it? Do you suppose you make really careful investments for kind of when you're 65 or 70? How many of us at the age of 22, 25, 31, 35, 40, how many of us would have had the vision to actually go, yeah, I'm spending mom and dad's money and my money and everything else because at the end of my life it's a zero balance? And how many of us would actually get to the end of our lives with anything to get to zero? The answer is we wouldn't, particularly in an environment where you've never had this issue addressed before. So now, to actually deal with civil unrest issues, I would argue China has to turn to domestic production and domestic consumption because they have to meet an unfulfilled demand which has never been evidenced on this planet. So, another investment idea? Whoever's knocking off iPods in China. By the way, I think Apple might actually be knocking off their own iPods in China, so you might actually want to just go with Apple there. But interestingly enough, you've got a very fascinating phenomenon that's emerging, which is this massive population. People, it's a third of our total population, which will actually cease to exist in a genealogical sense. Let that settle in on you for a second. And that's not 10 years from now. That's not 15 years from now. Those one-child families are actually coming into adulthood now. The Chinese government, with the transition of the fifth-generation leadership, is actually dealing with this issue now. If you had to choose, if you're in power in China today, if you had to choose, am I going to go with the future of the debt-ridden United States and buy more of their treasuries and prop up more of their debt, or I'm going to deal with civil unrest and make sure I placate people with consumables? If you're a fifth-generation China leader, what are you going to choose? And I can guarantee you that the answer is not, let's keep propping up the U.S. Guarantee. So, where are we? There's an interesting problem. Where are we in the crisis stage? We haven't seen the beginning of it. We have not seen the beginning of it. We will actually recognize the beginning of it when the FDIC is actually called on to actually liquidate real honest-to-goodness runs on banks. I mean real honest-to-goodness runs on banks. Yep?
Sorry, just help me out with the numbers here for a second. So the 170 million are at a certain level of household wealth and capacity to consume.
That's correct.
In the last 6 months, the Chinese stock markets have gone down 40 to 50%, and the corporates are in trouble. I'm having trouble coming up with where, I mean, I know the Chinese government will do anything by fiat it needs to do.
Right.
So I guess that would be the answer to the question. Where does the money come from that powers their consumption?
Very simple. They actually will short our treasuries at whatever rate they want to, use it to prop up a treasury reserve, which will be a basket. Congress is going to get what it asked for. It's just not going to get it in the way it asked for it. They will actually be, and this ties in, by the way, to the OPEC question. There will be a moment in time when OPEC settlements are not going to be done in dollars. It's very close to us. And what it will be is an exchange. As you already see, the Chinese contracts with Iran for oil and natural gas and the Chinese contract with Iraq is actually collateralized by U.S. treasuries. That's an interesting thing. You collateralize something with an asset that you actually are really fond of, right? Oh, no, that's right. You don't. You actually dump your collateral. Right now, China is actually already off the dollar, and that's the giant news that nobody's talking about. China's off the dollar because it collateralized its European purchases with dollars but purchased in euros. The European Central Bank got handed a stinking cheese, which is all of these wonderful revenue-generating opportunities for Airbus and all the great things for ABB and Alstom and Siemens and everything else. Siemens, we won't get into the ethics of how they did their procurements. That's something for the German prosecutors to deal with. But what's happening is all of those contracts are collateralized by the U.S. treasuries, and in effect, we've already seen China send all of its treasuries onto the ECB without ever exchanging a currency. What's really cool about that is all of the European technologies and all the European supplies that are coming in have already taken care of this problem. China's off the dollar.
Does that answer where the money comes for the consumption?
Yeah, because what you do is you just mint money around the yuan. You just revalue a capricious valuation. You can do that by fiat in China. You can do that by fiat anywhere else. Look at what we've done here. We print $50 billion worth of treasuries and we say people will buy them. Well, people do buy them, but the people who buy them are not people who actually have a long horizon view of the market. So we have China going autonomous, in my estimation, and that's already happening. That's not a will happen sometime. That is happening today. In all likelihood, they're going to walk away from their treasury holdings and they're going to walk away from their debt. Because we're going to be a debtor nation that, quite frankly, can't repay our debt. I don't know how many of you are interested in writing your current, I think it's $70,000 check that you need to do if you want to do your part to actually pay off the national debt. I think it's $70,000 per employed person. So I think you can do that. You can do that and you'll be helping the cause. What we'll have is a situation where as we move off of a China yuan dollar parity, which has happened, what we're going to do is we're going to see China go domestic. Who's going to get hurt in that process? Very important point. The people who are going to get hurt are actually people who have historically been our allies in the region. One of the ones that you're going to see get hurt soonest is Malaysia, and the other one you're going to see get hurt very soon is Singapore. These are very vital in the region, and they're very vital to the global economy. What do they do that is so important? Well, the answer is 40% of all global shipments have transshipment stopovers in Singapore and Malaysia. 40%. That's a big number. Stop exports from China. Guess how many things actually pass through those longshores in Singapore and in Malaysia? The answer is a giant Zippo. Malaysia and Singapore do not consume enough to keep large-scale shipments moving, which means that the economy of Singapore, which we forecast actually a year ago, is now susceptible to actually tanking with the Chinese export market. And now we're talking about months, not years. So Singapore is going to be an interesting thing to fall apart, and Singapore is a tough one to lose. Because Singapore, as those of you familiar with geopolitics know, Singapore has two vital industries we can't afford to lose in the region. Number one, stable banking. Very important part of the Singapore business and very important part of the global economy. Loss of Singapore as a transshipment for money is actually a very important failure in the system. The settlement banks, the clearinghouse banks, and the currency trading that happens in Singapore is vital to the economy, and losing the stability of that poses a grave international risk on the economic side. Now set the economics aside for a moment and realize something about the demographics of where Singapore sits. Singapore is surrounded, as most of you know, by 280, give or take, Muslims. Muslims that currently are actually in a more stirred up phase in terms of their overall engagement with trying to break down establishment situations potentially in Indonesia and in other parts, including Malaysia. There are a growing sense of unrest and opportunism at the same time. The unrest comes from the degradation in the perception of the West, and the opportunism is seen as a way to now vault onto the international stage as a meaningful player. What you will see is an increased awareness, first in Malaysia, second in Singapore, that they have to move off of their transshipment economies and move into a more substantial role in brokering regional transactions. You'll see this happen with the negotiation of additional free trade agreements, which Singapore is scurrying all over Africa, all over the Middle East, and all over Asia trying to lock up. You'll see some of the Singaporean and Malaysian efforts try to get into South America, which is perceived by many to be a growth market, and you'll see that interface happen. Another place to look at investment opportunities, if you have the appetite for a significant amount of volatility, are going to be those two markets. Because Singapore is going to figure some of this out, and they're going to not figure some of it out. If I had to guess where they do a relatively good job, I guess they would do a very good job on the financial markets piece. I think they're not going to do as good of a job on the industrial supply. Singapore's economy is inextricably linked to mass production from multinational corporations with domiciled production in Singapore, and when that plug gets pulled because of lack of available credit or anything else, I'd watch those situations very closely, because when Singapore has the major pharma companies, the chemical companies, and the microelectronics companies that actually lose their credit capability, those things will ripple to Singapore long before they hit the motherland of wherever those companies are from. But that doesn't say Singapore is not without opportunity and without option, because once again you have a fairly well-managed nation state that has central control. And back to my comment about China, they can do a lot by fiat, which is less likely to be done here. The other piece of the investment, to actually weave the threads back together, the other piece of the investment internationally is you see a growing involvement of places like Libya, like Egypt, like Oman, Qatar, Kuwait, and to a lesser degree, and I know this is going to come as very unpatriotic, but Iran. Iran has played a very major role in setting up and reinforcing the stability of Swiss banks. They did that in large part by moving the Bank Mali off the dollar and onto the euro, which is a very significant event. Once again, went largely unnoticed by the United States, but it was a very important event. And when that event happened, you actually get the precursor once again to the OPEC situation, because for the first time you actually aren't having Iran future productions going through US denominated currencies, you're actually having it go through euros. You're going to see more of that. I'm going to argue for the death of both the dollar and the euro from the standpoint of their current hegemony, however. I think what you're going to see is the emergence of alternative value units. And alternative value units are actually fundamentally different from currency. They exist in network transactions. It's not just barter, and a lot of people simplify it and say, well, are you basically saying it's going to be barter? The answer is no. Much like Dubai has built its economy around the notion of the exchange of value. I mean, remember, they outfitted pirate ships on both sides of the Napoleonic Wars. You know, the British would sail in, get their stuff outfitted, they'd sail out. The French would sail in, get their stuff outfitted. Dubai was a master at selling to both sides of a war and propping up their economy on both sides of a war. They've been very good at that, by the way, in the modern economy. That's why Halliburton moved over there. Halliburton moved over there because it's a very comfortable place, and I'm not even being critical. It's a good business decision. Go to a place that's always done that. Their business has been to service whoever needs servicing. That's their business. So when you actually have Dubai playing its role, you have Abu Dhabi playing its role, you have Qatar playing its role, you see a very interesting convergence. And here's where I think we have a future instability geopolitically. The issue is we've got the Straits of Hormuz, which we don't know what we're going to do with. Because it used to be that we had kind of a mutual assured destruction agreement where you have Iran on one side, you have our allies on the other side, and it all works out. There's a problem. When we finally find out that Citibank doesn't have the liquidity it has, I think we may lose a lot of our allies in the region. Because I believe that most of our alliances in the Gulf states right now are fundamentally alliances of convenience, not alliances of ideology. I think when you have a president of a country, ours, who stands in front of royalty and says, we're proud to be in democracies. You heard me right. Okay? Stood in front of Sheikh Mohammed and talked about how great it was to be in a democracy. You want out of touch. That's not out of touch. That's another planet. Now, I'm not going to sit here and advocate for anything against the government of Dubai. Quite frankly, I think what they do in their country, by and large, is a relatively good track record. I think they've got some sketchy issues on one side or the other, of a few issues around things like workers' rights and other things, but by and large, they've done fairly well in a monarchy. And when our president stands up and says that he's grateful for all the democracies in the region, my instinct was to go, like, which one? I'm not sure which democracy he was referring to. The only one that's even in earshot of his speech was Iran. And I'm not sure we're grateful for that democracy. I don't know. Maybe it's just me and I'm not understanding something, but there is a problem there. What happens when we actually find out that the sovereign reserves accounts that currently sit in U.S.-denominated dollars, in U.S.-denominated institutions, backed up by, get this, Prince in Saudi Arabia, who calls Charlie Prince at Citibank and says, Charlie, I'm going to give you another $10 billion, but this is the last one, right? And Charlie goes, yeah, man, we're good. We're good. Prince to Prince, we're good. Bam, hangs up the phone. 10 days later, I think we need another $10 billion. At some